Hi, everyone, and welcome to 2024. I'm John Timpane.
And I'm Don Rooney. Now, you've probably had it up to here, or maybe here.
Or maybe even here.
With callbacks to all the stuff that happened in 2023.
Well, like a lot of you, we just like to forget 2023.
So on this first episode of the Musical Innertube for 2024, we'll look back, way back, farther back than just 2023.
Let's go back to the TV themes of yesterday as we talk with John Burlingame, author of the book Music for Primetime.
He's the nation's leading writer on the subject of music for films and television. He writes regularly for Variety and has also written for newspapers like the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Washington Post, and magazines such as Premiere and the Hollywood Reporter. He's the author of 5 books, the latest of which is entitled Music for Primetime. It's a history of American television themes and scoring. It is a fantastic book. I recommend it highly to everyone. John Burlingame, welcome to the Musical Innertube.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
We were just talking before we started recording about all of the music from television that we as baby boomers went through when we were kids. When I was reading your book, I said all of those themes popped immediately into my head when I read any of the titles on there. 77 Sunset Strip and Cheyenne and Gunsmoke and all the other ones. Why do you think, and again, I remember those better than I remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, but why do those themes stick in our heads like that?
Well, there are a number of reasons. The most obvious one is the week-to-week repetition, particularly of shows that we loved and watched regularly, combined with the rerun factor. Let's face it, Gilligan's Island was only on the air for 3 years, but it has rerun endlessly ever since. And if you don't know that theme backwards and forwards, you have somehow managed to miss a huge moment in pop culture history. So it's the endless repetition combined with the fact that, particularly in that era that you're talking about, which is late 50s, throughout the 1960s and into the 70s, many of these themes were written by very talented composers, some of which came out of Tin Pan Alley, some of whom came out of the movies and were writing high quality music for motion pictures. And then some we just discovered along the way who understood the need to capture a mood or a vibe within 60 seconds.
That's interesting because we talk about earworms today, but these are brainworms. These they were so good at what they did. And I think we can talk about that a little bit. Is they were good. They only had like a minute, maybe even less, maybe 30 seconds at the beginning of a show to hit that theme. And still today, I'm walking down the street going, Kathy adores minuet, the ballet russe and crepes. You know what I mean? Why is that there?
Sure.
I don't want it there. Well, I don't care if it's there or not, but it's so, I don't want to even say catchy. It's more than that. It sort of just moves in and stays.
This is the thing about both television and film to a certain extent, which is that when great music is married with memorable images, it becomes something else. Particularly, as I say, it's not just an earworm, it's a brainworm, to use your term, because we remember very often not just the tune, but we remember the imagery that accompanies it. Somebody asked me the other day if I had a guilty pleasure or a guilty pleasure favorite theme. And I had to think about it for a minute, but it came out of the woodwork, as all these things do, which was My Mother the Car.
Yes.
Which was, I don't know if either of you remember the show.
Oh, yes.
It's now gone down into, pop culture history as arguably the worst show in the history of the medium. But that tune.
I remember the theme, yes.
And it was Follow the Bouncing Ball because they actually reproduced the lyrics on screen during the main title. 1928 Porter.
That's my mother, dear.
A 1928 Porter. That's my mother, dear. She helps me through everything I do, and I'm so glad she's here. My mother the car. My mother the car.
I do remember that.
So all of these things, talk about a tune that you don't necessarily want to pop into your brain at any particular moment.
Right.
But it did this morning on walking the dog, while I was walking the dog. And so there you go.
Right, exactly. I don't know why, but, and it must say something about me, but I just don't know what it is, that the music, both the theme music and the situational music used in Clutch Cargo, which only ran, I think, for one season, I think, 1959 to 60. You know, these things where they basically used still art with moving mouths.
Yes.
In a very odd sort of, yeah, I don't know. A couple of cartoon
very
shows.
scary.
Yeah,
Yes.
it was weird.
Yes.
But that music, I'll be singing when they throw the dirt on me. It's.
Clutch Cargo and his pals Spinner and Paddlefoot in another exciting adventure, The Friendly Headhunters.
The technique was called Synchrovox.
Okay.
And although I watched Clutch Cargo, I was really enamored of its outer space sequel, Space Angel.
Yes.
Yes.
Blast off for another exciting adventure in outer space with Scott McCloud, Space Angel, in the story of The Cosmic Combat.
Which was the science fiction show that followed by the same producers.
Yes.
And I was obsessed with Space Angel in 1963 or
Oh,
64. And so that's the theme that I actually remember. I think Clutch Cargo had bongo drums because there were so many jungle settings, but that's, I could be wrong.
Now, these themes obviously
We've already, by the way, alienated all of our listeners.
Yeah.
except for the 5 that are sitting now with that bongo Clutch Cargo theme in their head right now. Anyway, these themes obviously are set to make an impression on you right away and to set the table, so to speak, for the show. Once you get through the theme, you have an idea of what you're going to be seeing in the next 30 or 60 minutes. So, and I would say that I guess music scattered throughout the show does the same thing. It's kind of like, I guess they call them music cues because it sort of lets you know what's going on, whether it's thrilling or comedic or whatever. So there's a lot of thought that goes into even the smallest piece of music that winds up in a TV show.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's one of the reasons that, the publisher wanted to call the book not just a history of TV themes, but also TV themes and scoring, because I tackle both parts of the sort of musical equation in my book. Music in television accomplishes essentially the same thing that music in films do, except faster and generally with less money to pay. For the composer and the musicians and everything. And so, but music is an integral part of that storytelling process. It can set the tone. It can, put you in a time and place. It can, certainly in the case of sitcoms, tell the backstory via song lyrics. But it can also provide a kind of emotional bed. It can sort of help us feel whatever the filmmakers are striving for us to feel at that moment. And so it's a big job for a composer in television, particularly when you've only got 3, 4, 5 days to actually write music that, in a film context, you might have been given a month.
I recall a story. The gist of it was that Sherwood Schwartz was selling Gilligan's Island to the network, and he was having trouble with it because they said, how can we reestablish the fact that these people are stranded on a desert island every week? And he said, well, let the theme do that. And the implication there was that the theme sold the show. And again, that's another one that I can recite from heart, that I can sit in the shower and sing the whole damn thing all the way through.
Well, goodbye, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to end this episode of the Musical Innertube right now.
Well, Don, that's exactly right. That's exactly what happened. I actually talked to Sherwood Schwartz about that specific meeting that you're talking about. And I tell that story in the book. Sherwood, the CBS executives, were skeptical about the notion of, suppose somebody tuned into at week 3 or 4, how would they know how these 7 stranded castaways wound up on this desert island? And Sherwood's idea was, we'll tell the backstory in a song. And although it became somewhat different than Sherwood's original concept, because Sherwood, who was a kind of amateur, piano picking out a note at a time player, had written a calypso. And when he took it to his composer friend George Weil, George said, wait a minute, the calypso is from the Caribbean. You need a sea chanty if this is going to be a South Seas island. So he took the lyrics and basically set them to a brand new tune that was something more of a sort of a rollicking sea chanty, and hence the song that we all know.
We all know right down to our shoes.
Just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip that started from this tropic port aboard this tiny ship. The mate was a mighty sailing man, the skipper brave and sure. 5 passengers set sail that day for a 3-hour tour. A 3-hour tour. The weather started getting rough, the tiny ship was tossed. If not for the courage of the fearless crew, the minnow would be lost. The minnow would be lost. The ship's aground on the shore of this uncharted desert isle, with Gilligan, the skipper too, the millionaire and his wife, the movie star.
And we all know, of course, that it was different between seasons 1 and 2 and season 3 when they added the Professor and Mary Ann, because in the first couple of seasons it was and the rest, and then somehow I guess it became popular enough to put the Professor and Mary Ann as part of the original theme.
Well, I had to believe that the agents got involved in that one.
Yeah.
After season 1, it became the Professor and Mary Ann.
Yeah, there's a completely different song at the end, a completely different set of lyrics to see, and I think the end of it is, come on back next week to see what happens to the castaways. But it's a completely different set of lyrics for the end, over the ending credits.
Now this is the tale of our castaways. They're here for a long, long time. They'll have to make the best of things. It's an uphill climb. The first mate and his skipper too will do their very best to make the others comfortable in their tropic island nest.
No phone, no light,
no motor cars, not a single luxury. Like Robinson Crusoe, it's primitive as can be. So join us here each week, my friends. You're sure to get a smile from 7 stranded castaways here on Gilligan's Island.
Yeah, that's right. And in this case, what you're talking about is, although Sherwood never admitted to it, the model at that point was actually the Beverly Hillbillies, another CBS show that told the backstory in the main title and had a slightly different song performed also by Flatt and Scruggs under the end title visuals. And so, come on back next week and see what happens next.
Again, I can remember that one. Y'all come back now here. Okay.
That's
It's it. Well, let's talk about composers other than Sherwood Shorts. There were a lot of big names in flipping through the first few pages of your book, a lot of big movie names that had come to television to do scores. Were they slumming? Was there not enough movie work left, or did they actually feel like television music was worth doing?
It depends on who you talk to, really. Victor Young, who was a major film composer in the 1930s and 40s, actually did Medic in 1954. That was Richard Boone's first show, and it was a medical drama. And Victor Young wrote a great theme and actually something more than 30 individual scores for those half-hour shows. This was the first instance of a big movie name coming to television. But Max Steiner, who was, of course, perhaps the biggest composer of that era, Casablanca, King Kong, Gone with the Wind, was approached when he was in his declining period in the 1960s to do music for Hawaiian Eye because he was a Warner Brothers standard over there. And he was mystified by the fact that they wanted him to establish a mood in 9 seconds. And he did write a handful of very small pieces, but never got screen credit for it. So if you're watching Hawaiian Eye, you might accidentally stumble into some Max Steiner tunes. But when you talk about big names, really, so many people that became big time movie composers actually started in television. When you think about Jerry Goldsmith, some of his early themes like Dr. Kildare, The Man from U.N.C.L.E., and he sort of, and perhaps the biggest name of all was John Williams, who was basically not just obscure, but totally unheard of when he started in television in 1958.
Yeah, I think
he did 7 years.
Your book says his original name was Johnny Williams, or that was his original credit.
Well, if you look at old episodes of Lost in Space, or my favorite Private Eye show of his, Checkmate, or even M Squad, the old Lee Marvin cop show, that'll say music by Johnny Williams, and he eventually became John Williams.
And I think the most nominated person for Oscars, Biggest Loser, right? I think he's lost 35 times. He's won a couple times, but
he's won 5.
5, right.
And that's right. But he has 50 some nominations, I think. I wouldn't call him a loser in any
no, I wouldn't either
sense.
in any sense at all. But didn't Elmer Bernstein write the music for things like The Big Valley and things like this? I think Bernstein, and he wrote a lot of documentary music. He was a presence. Obviously, he would write for anybody's birthday party. I mean, he was really a busy guy and kept busy.
My daughter's turning 7. Can you come over and play the piano?
What time you want me to have?
You're absolutely you're absolutely right about that, John, because and he was, frankly, when he came to television in 58 to do the General Electric Theater, and then in 59 to do Riverboat and Staccato, he was already a big name, having done the 10 Commandments and The Man with the Golden Arm at that point.
Yes.
But didn't think of it as slumming. To these guys, it was a fascinating new arena for music making that did require you to write faster and get paid less money. But and we don't talk about this much, but there's actually an enormous back end payment. There are royalties and residuals that come back to the composer, particularly on a successful show. I remember talking to the late Gerald Fried, who was perhaps is best known for Roots, and I asked him, what is, it's none of my business, of course, but I couldn't help but ask. He'd done so much television in the 1960s, whether Star Trek, which he had worked on in the 60s, was his biggest revenue stream. And the answer was no. It was Gilligan's Island, because those shows rerun everywhere, all the time, everywhere in the world. And he had done, maybe, I don't know, probably 20 of them, but they just rerun constantly. And he made a fortune off 10 and 20-second cues in Gilligan's Island.
Gerald Fried has passed away recently, just within the last month or so.
That's right.
And the obituaries all said, he's the guy that wrote the Mr. Spock theme in Star Trek. That, the one that kept, every time there was an exotic fight with an animal or something. You could have said he did music for Roots, which was a very prestigious show at its time, and people would have said, "Oh, that's nice." But the minute you put in, and he did the Spock fight theme in Star Trek, everybody went, "Oh, that one, yes, I know that."
That's exactly right. And the episode was called Amok Time. And that was the episode where, Spock went back to Vulcan and he was going to be, mated with another Vulcan, and there was all kinds of, anyway. So, but Fried, being a, clever and, and dramatically astute composer came up with music that worked for that particular fight. And who could have known, in 1966, that would have become iconic in the history of television scoring. And that's been parodied a million times.
When John was talking about watching Clutch Cargo, I remember watching a lot of the Hanna-Barbera cartoons.
Yeah.
And they had the same music recycled over and over again. Studios and I guess I could say, if I paid attention, maybe some of the old Westerns and some of those old ones had recurring themes, but that were not limited to that one show. You could hear those themes on several different shows. Was there a whole bank of music that these studios had? And when you're going to score a show, just for the dramatic effect, the fight or the love scene or whatever, you could go into this pool of music and pick something that you wanted?
Well, that's true. But that really pertains more to the 1950s and early 1960s in television history. There was a long period, most of the 1950s, in fact, where producers who didn't really appreciate the value of an original score would rely on libraries, production music as it's known today, which is basically generic dramatic music that they could license and then have access to. For example, except for the theme, all of the Adventures of Superman in its entire run, which is like 8 or 9 seasons, was actually library music, not written specifically for those shows, but actually written as kind of generic dramatic music to be applied wherever a music supervisor or a music editor felt was appropriate. And this went on. In the case of the Hanna-Barbera cartoons, much of that early music was written by the great Hoyt Curtin.
Yes.
The Flintstones, the Jetsons, Top Cat, Johnny Quest, all of that stuff from the early 1960s. And Hanna-Barbera had no problem recycling from show to show. So, if a Jetsons cue seemed to fit for a Top Cat episode, well, so be it, and it was great, I must admit. I worked on an album of Johnny Quest music a few years ago, and I just reveled in that stuff because I loved the show, and Hoyt was given an opportunity there to write action adventure music instead of sort of the lighthearted Flintstone stuff he had been doing. But yeah, libraries were quite popular, and of course, let's get back to the money thing. Producers don't want to spend money if they don't have to, and so if this looked cheap and seemed like it would do the job, then, yes, they went after it. Music can be a great asset in storytelling. Too much music essentially becomes wallpaper and diminishes its effectiveness when it needs to make an important point. So the fact is, and I talk to composers about this all the time as I write about this music for Variety, very often, like on a Star Trek show, if there's 42 minutes of program material, they're generally writing 40 minutes of music for that show. Mm-hmm. And does it need it? Probably not. But this is about how storytelling on television has changed, and their view of music has changed through the years. I can remember Norman Felton, the producer of Dr. Kildare and The Man from U.N.C.L.E., talking to me about Jerry Goldsmith and how they would always think that, less is more. If you don't need music for a certain scene, if the actors are carrying it, if the point is being made dramatically without music, then don't add music. What's the point? It's being redundant to the scene. But if music can add something that the visuals are not telling you at that moment, then it's definitely worthwhile and should be applied. So I was watching an episode of Succession the other day, a show which I think not only has a great theme, but a great score by composer Nicholas Britell. And I was surprised at how little music there actually was in the show. And because the dramatic thrust and the performances were so powerful that adding music would have been gilding the lily to a certain degree. And so, you don't always need wall-to-wall music. And of course, there's actually very little music in most sitcoms. It's generally transitions in and out of scenes. Sometimes there's a button at the end of a scene. Certainly, I remember talking to Gabriel Mann, the composer of Modern Family, about this subject. And he would talk about how, if the family was sort of getting together and everything was fine at the end of the show, well, you might need 20 seconds of sort of warm family music to sort of make us all feel good as we go out, that kind of thing. But it depends on the show, and it depends on the showrunner and with their general attitude toward music.
That's very interesting.
What about using popular music in a show to accent the feelings in it? How I Met Your Mother, Friends, Scrubs, other shows like that would use a popular song or something that sounds like a popular song to sort of close out the end of the episode with words that sort of convey the meaning of whatever's going on or the sort of the wrap up of the show. So what about that?
Yeah. This period really started with Miami Vice in 1984. When Michael Mann came to NBC to sort of launch this, basically a cop show set in South Florida dealing with sort of drug dealers and drug transactions, Michael thought that the use of popular songs, pop and rock generally, sometimes, Latin music, because of course we were in South Florida and very often in the Caribbean, might be a different way to approach the use of music. And so this was sort of the beginning of the music supervision era in television, where you would actually license pre-existing songs that for one reason or another would make a dramatic point. So this really caught on by the late 80s and early 90s. And so music supervisors then became not just in demand, but actually somewhat powerful in terms of their ability to punctuate scenes with popular songs, generally pre-existing ones, although sometimes new ones would be written for the show itself, which is what I frankly prefer. I think there's no substitute for a song that is written specifically for a scene or as a theme that applies directly to the characters and the story being told. But boy, music supervision is a very big deal today in television because many showrunners believe that songs do help tell the story. I think the popularity of the use of songs now was to a certain degree pioneered in the 1990s and early 2000s by the music supervisor Alex Patsavas, and particularly in shows like The O.C. and Gilmore Girls, and particularly on Grey's Anatomy. And this is where the sort of the television business crosses over into the record business, because Alex was so good at finding end of episode songs for Grey's Anatomy that very often if she found something that was somewhat obscure or perhaps nobody had ever heard before, and she'd put it on, the iTunes would soar the next day.
Yes.
And you would realize that this music was not only being effective in the storytelling of the show, but it was selling records too. And well, everybody loves that because there's more money to be made.
Yes. Yeah.
But Alex, who and I talk about this in a sidebar toward the end of the book about the development of the idea of utilizing popular songs in television. And now it's a whole industry.
And the art of taking the theme song, like the theme from Friends or something like that, and making it a top 40 hit, has also come about in the last few years. Do you think that when assembling a show, that gets into people's heads too? Hey, if we have a theme song that we can then release to radio, that's going to bring people to the show.
I don't think that that's talked about all that much anymore because it is so unusual for a TV theme to become a hit. But it was in the minds of producers long ago, particularly in view of the success of Peter Gunn in 1958-59, and that tune not only went to number one, but that album wound up winning the very first Grammy ever awarded for Record of the Year. And so all of a sudden, everybody thought, "Gee, let's get our theme on the radio," And so the idea was, and then of course, you jump into the '60s and you find record chart success for Mission Impossible and Hawaii Five-0. And Miami Vice in the '80s, and the Rockford Files.
Welcome Back, Kotter.
Welcome Back, Kotter went to number one, and that was a John Sebastian tune. And in fact, the show wasn't called Welcome Back, Kotter until Sebastian came in, played this song, and they thought, "Gee, welcome back. Let's rename the show," which had been called Kotter.
Welcome back.
So they renamed the show after the song.
They renamed the show after the song, went to number one, and so so it did happen. Not always, in fact, rarely. But you're right. The Friends tune was very popular on radio in 1995, and Twin Peaks, even an instrumental, got on the radio.
Oh yeah,
in that early '90s period.
So let's also talk about the demise of the theme song. In the 90s and into the 2000s, you mentioned Modern Family. Modern Family has like a 30-second ha, 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 for their theme song. There's not even really a lot of musicality to it. There were obviously the story we've heard is that networks pressured to cut back on the theme songs to have more time to sell commercials. So is that indeed what you heard in your interviews? And what did people who were making music for TV think about that when they were told, "Okay, you got 12 seconds to do an intro"?
Yeah, I remember this very clearly because I was at the press conference at ABC in the summer of 1994 when the head of ABC programming declared that television theme songs were now useless, pointless, and were eating up time that I think, Don, I'm not sure so much it was about selling more commercial time as it was they were desperately afraid in this cable plus network era that people would, since they'd seen the main title once already, the week before or the week before that they would hit that remote control button because they were bored and they were going to go somewhere else. So the network executives, terrified of losing viewers to some other channel, thought, well, what do we need this, 30 seconds or 40 seconds or 1 minute of lost program time for? And what's interesting was, of course, that fall, Friends came on the air with a great, memorable 1-minute theme that went on the radio, and I think it led some people to rethink it. But it is true that trend has continued to this day where, I talk about this in the book, the theme for Castle, which was a 1-hour ABC drama a few years ago. I remember talking to Bob Duncan about writing that main title. He had 7 seconds to make the point. At 7 seconds, you can barely, there's barely a musical phrase in 7 seconds, So, you do the best you can.
I do remember watching that sitcom Wings. And for the first couple of years, it had a nice long open with a Franz Schubert theme. And then about third or fourth season in, it was just a couple of hits on the piano of the Schubert theme, and then we're into the show. So again, that was what got me thinking about shows that used to have great themes that suddenly were rushed along to get into the show.
And what bothers me about watching Cheers in reruns is that fabulous song, the greatest song about a bar ever written, it was about a minute in its original form in the 1980s. But now in reruns, it's cut down to 20 seconds, maybe 30 at most. And I miss that song.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It reminds me of where we are. It brings me back into that wonderful place with those people. And the main title visuals are spectacular. Those sort of turn of the century drawings of people in saloons. There's an art to this. And in fact, I think the television theme is a kind of miniature art form in a way. I think that's never been really given the level of respect it's due.
What do you see for the future? I know you mentioned Succession. That has excellent music. And a lot of the cable shows have some pretty good music attached to them. Do you think we're getting back into an area now where the music is going to be more married to the action and shows are going to be scored more?
Well, I think what gives me hope and what certainly heartens me on this whole idea is the world of cable and streaming, where you're actually paying to watch this channel, and very often you're paying to watch a certain show or two on this channel. So executives are less worried about people flying away to some other place. So you're actually getting some really great, sometimes not just a minute, sometimes a minute and a half, minute and 45 seconds of a especially and often beautifully built series of visuals that bring us back into that world. Think about Game of Thrones, Succession, House of Cards had a great main title, and which not only reminds us of the music, but also reminds us who's in the show, what the show's about. It sort of eases us into that world from our day-to-day humdrum world.
Sopranos comes to mind too.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly. And that's a pre-existing song that was used brilliantly to remind us where we are, along with the visuals.
Well, John Burlingame, thanks very much for being with us today. There's a ton more we could talk to.
My goodness, we'll have to have you on again. One realizes just how much one has lived one's life among tunes, and themes and just little snippets of music that stay with you forever and are associated with happy memories a lot of the time.
Yes, and there are usually at least 40 or 50 more songs that we could sing together.
That's right. John and Don, thank you so much for having me on. It's been such a joy.
We hope you enjoyed that trip to the past with John Burlingame.
Now, let's go back even farther to the days when radio was king.
Let's visit with our old pal, Mike Hinkson, who is a fan of vintage radio shows.
Hi, Mike.
Hi,
Mike. How did you get started with it? I'm just wondering. Did you hear old time radio when you were little? Is that how it got started, or how did it get started? How did collecting get started?
So I remember in 1957, I was listening to, I think it was 57. I was listening to KNX out here in Los Angeles. And by that time, I had become a fan of the Kingston Trio and their song Tom Dooley. And I heard them say, on Suspense tonight, we're going to do the story of Tom Dooley. And I went, oh, what's that about? So I just decided to leave it on. And at 5 o'clock, this other show came on entitled Yours Truly, Johnny Dollar, that I had never heard of. The man with the action-packed expense account, America's freelance insurance investigator. Anyway, I listened to that. That sounded pretty cool. And then I heard the Tom Dooley story, which very much paralleled the Kingston Trio song version. So, one stole it from the other. Most people would say the Kingston Trio had their portable copyright machine with them and they stole it from somebody else. But either way, so I listened to that and that got me intrigued. And so I then started looking for other programs, and there were a couple of other programs on KNX. But then a couple of years later, my dad knew I was interested in this stuff, and I was listening by that time regularly to Yours Truly, Johnny Dollar, Suspense, Have Gun Will Travel, which is one of the few shows that went from TV to radio and not the other way, and then Gunsmoke. So anyway, he came across this article that said that another station out here, KHJ, was going to play syndicated reruns of The Shadow and another program called The Green Hornet, both of which I had never heard of, but he read me the article. So I started listening to them and just was very intrigued because all of these shows really gave you the opportunity to use your mind, such as it might be, as opposed to just having everything show up on a TV screen. And I loved being able to imagine, and it just got really intriguing. And then so by 1968, I was starting to look for ways to collect programs, and I had the opportunity to get some. And then my father, who was working at Edwards Air Force Base, had someone that he worked with who, in fact, had collected a bunch of the rebroadcasts of radio programs from the Armed Forces Radio Network. And they let me borrow what they had so I could start a collection, which became the first set of programs that we used when I went off to UC Irvine, and the campus radio station started there. And by 1970, I had joined the station staff in 68 or early 69, but by the September of 1969, I was playing radio programs every Sunday night full time.
Yeah. That's
Now, you said that you got hooked on these in the late 50s. And I think when people think of old time radio or radio dramas, they think maybe 30s and 40s when it was flourishing. But these shows went on and on and on. Well, way into the 60s, was it? I guess Gunsmoke would have been on radio and television simultaneously in that situation.
Correct, until 1962. Have Gun Will Travel, as I said, came from TV to radio because there was enough demand for it. There were still some soap operas being broadcast into the 60s. Ma Perkins was one. And then, of course, the other thing that happened later was that people started producing new shows. National Public Radio, of course, produced Star Wars for radio. There was another series called Alien Worlds that was on for 3 years on NPR. A company, ZBS Media, Z with a zebra, started and produced a 13-week serial called The Fourth Tower of Inverness, which we played on KUCI faithfully every day.
How well I remember. Yes.
Yeah, I was in by 8:30 every morning putting on a cart the episode of the day.
And now, kiddies, just like back in those days of yore, the whole family can once again huddle around that beautiful mahogany cabinet, slowly turn that great heavy dial, and stare blankly at the speaker as in your mind vague forms begin to shape themselves. Can you see the mad alchemist with the bent frame, Dr. Missoula?
Yeah, well, Good God!
Or the strange child, little Frida. She wears pigtails, smokes Havana cigars, and has no pupils in her eyes. Yet she can see thought forms.
You will arrive at a place where you'll be able to be anywhere, whenever you wish. For the place where you will be is outside time and space.
And we had a lot of fun with those and other programs as well. And radio still continues to flourish. Of course, there's the long-time radio program, Harry Niles, The Adventures of Harry Niles, a private detective, and it's been on for many, many years and still continues to this day.
Yeah, that's very interesting, Michael, because I think in our new sort of blasted wide open media world, it's easy to say, well, audio shows, are a thing of the past. But I think in two ways, they certainly are not. One is that unprecedented efforts have been made to archive as many recordings of the older shows as people can possibly find. And I know there's this huge market for them. People trade for them. There's a buying and selling market. There are all these conventions all over the world. Have you ever been to one of those, by the way, an old, golden years of radio convention like that?
I haven't. I would like to, and hope to get to one of these days. But of course, with COVID, that's more difficult. But I know a number of the people who have been and keep up with the goings on at the various conventions. And at some of the conventions, there have been recreations of some of the old programs.
So the old radio shows are out there if you want to listen to them.
They're all over.
Yeah, and there are entire radio stations, both virtual and actual, that play a lot of them. There's one Canadian station that has them every night, and in fact, I can get it from here. I can get it from New Jersey at night when I'm traveling around. So I listen to this one Canadian radio station.
Railway station.
Yes, this one Canadian railway station, and the train gets.
You sit in the lounge.
It's a very comfortable lounge. So, but
what station? Do you remember the name? The call letters?
Well, it begins with C, so that won't help anybody.
Yeah.
I don't remember the call letters, but it's almost every night. Well, they're playing like.
There's one. It's in Pennsylvania. It's WNAR. And that one is a live station, but they also are on the internet. Yes. So I listen to it with my little Amazon Echo and tell it to play WNAR. One of the best and well-known stations is an internet station called Yesterday USA that's been on for like 30 plus years. Used to be run by a guy named Bill Bragg in Texas, and it's now being run. Bill has passed. To that big transmitter in the sky. And now it is being run by Walden Hughes and John and Larry Gassman, who are out here in Los Angeles. Walden was a frequent guest when Bill Bragg had the station and was asked to continue it, and he has. And so Yesterday USA, there is a red network and a blue network, just like on NBC for the longest time. And they do generally play different shows unless there's something special that they're doing that is common that they want everyone to hear. Like Gloria McMillan, who was a famous actress in radio on a variety of shows, recently passed, and they did the funeral for her last Saturday. So that was on both the red and the blue network. But Yesterday USA is the best station probably all around for providing old radio programs today for people to listen to.
YouTube has an entire channel completely devoted to them. So does Spotify.
Right.
And
Sirius XM has Greg Bell.
Yeah, that's right. And what I love about this is that if you don't know anything about this world, it's right at your fingertips. I think you could say, in fact, it's got to be true that these shows are now more available to a greater number of people potentially than they've ever been. If it's something that you find interesting or want to experience, they're out there for you.
Let's talk a little bit about the theater of the mind thing that we mentioned earlier, and that is that radio was sound only, and therefore they had to create a whole world. And as much as your mind worked hard, the sound effects people in old radio worked very hard to create something that your mind could then, finish painting the picture. And that was an art back in the day, as much as announcing was or acting was, to be a sound effects person for radio.
And some shows did it better than others. Gunsmoke was very well known for its sound effects. And they used all sorts of different things to create the sound. Matt Dillon, you could always tell when Matt Dillon was walking because he always had the sound of spurs on his feet. His boots had spurs on them. So you always knew Matt Dillon from anyone else, but it was absolutely specifically ongoing that every time you heard Matt, you heard the spurs. But there were so many other things. You heard the coyotes at night, and even Matt and Chester would talk about the coyotes and one sounding lonely in the distance. You could hear train whistles of trains on the tracks that might be some distance away, and all the other things of Dodge City and wherever they were.
Even if I only had $1. Oh, Miss Kitty, just one single $1.
You broke, Chester?
Well, yes.
Here you go.
Oh, no. Now, I just couldn't think of taking money from a lady, Mr.
Well, I'll take
except
it.
as a loan. Maybe I could. Excuse me, Mr. Dillon. I'll pay it back in just a few minutes.
You know, Kitty, you're a born soft touch.
Oh, well, if he needs it, Matt.
It's those sharps over there at the poker table that need it.
Oh, well, he can't get hurt bad on $1.
Chester's hurt bad when he loses 10 cents.
Yeah? Maybe he's lucky, Matt.
How so?
Oh... Forget it, Matt. Just one of those nights, I guess.
No. Dad, would a drink help, maybe?
Probably not. But I'll have one anyway. At least it won't do me any harm.
Okay.
Oh, well, I see
see the Marshal of Dodge is out carousing again.
Hello, Doc.
How are you, Doc?
Oh, my kitty, you look prettier than a basket full of sunflowers.
I remember hearing a Gunsmoke on the radio when I probably was 6. I used to go for the summers. I'd spend a week at Grandma and Grandpa's house, at both sets of grandparents, and they were still listening to these radio programs. And I just fell into the habit. I'd sit around with them and just listen for hours. In fact, we listened probably to the radio more than we watched the television together, which is saying something when you're 6. But I think, like you, Michael, Marshall McLuhan calls these cold media. What he means by that is you have to add the energy yourself to imagining it.
Right.
And you have to put the heat in from your perspective as a listener. And it's not a medium that does everything for you, like showing you the pictures and making sure that you see exactly like a hot medium would be something like movies and television. But what's so great about radio, and I still think it's one of the great mediums of all time, media of all time, is that it's cold, that you have to come across and live in it yourself. And once you get in that habit, I think it's really hard to break it.
Well, and in fact, should you? The fact of the matter is that with radio, you did have to use your mind. You did have to think. And if you, I don't want to say worked at it at all, but if you paid attention, you were drawn in and you became part of the show in that sense. And it didn't matter whether you viewed Matt Dillon differently than I or Amos and Andy differently than I. That wasn't really the point. The point was that you were drawn in and you were very much involved with hearing and becoming absorbed by the plot. And they would use voices, they would use sound effects, they would use music to help enhance the plot in various ways. And some shows did it better than others, certainly. But the reality is that it made you be a part of the show, which you don't get to do on television. You can look at a show today and you can go, yeah, I understand that, or I can see that, but you're not drawn into it the way you are on radio. And that's why radio is still popular today, even though we've gone more to talk radio and waste a lot of time on so many different things with that. But as you pointed out, both of you, there are so many stations that still do old time radios, the Sirius XMs and the Spotify's, and of course, Yesterday USA and other internet radio stations, and they're easy to find. Just search them, or you can learn a lot by going to Yesterday USA because they talk about other programs and other stations and so on as well.
That also gives the idea that this is not nostalgia in the purest sense of the word, and that is that people our age or people older than us who grew up with radio as part of their media diet, this would, if there are, especially in places like Sirius XM, where they're really, there's a fight for some channels and that sort of thing, and they're not going to waste a channel if they don't have to. So that means that there is some demand for this among people who are younger, who are just discovering it for the first time.
And I'm on several old time radio lists, and we see that all the time. People talk about younger people or young people come on and they say they want to know more about things regarding old radio. There's also a number of organizations. There's the Radio Enthusiasts of Puget Sound. Probably the largest and most well-known is one called SPURDVAC. Let's see if I can do it. Society for the Preservation and Enhancement of Radio Drama, Radio Variety. I guess it's drama, radio variety, and comedy, SPURDVAC.
It rolls right off the lips, doesn't it? It's just,
yes, exactly.
Yeah. SPURDVAC, and it's like $20 a year to be a member. You can go to spurdvac.org. But it is it's absolutely one of the best places to really go, where you can even meet all of the old people who are still alive doing it and so on.
And that also brings to mind the wide variety of radio. I mean, you think of radio and you think of sound effects and everything. You think of the old time, like you said, suspense or Gunsmoke or something. But there were variety shows, there were comedy shows, there were information shows. There was as wide a variety on radio as there is on television today.
Oh, sure. And for years, there was a program on NBC called Monitor, especially on the weekend, that went for hours every day. They had everything from old radio shows, or some of the actors created their characters and they continued them. Fibber McGee and Molly was one. And they also had the news, and they had a lot of current information as to what was going on in places. And Monitor was on for many years on NBC. It isn't today, but people collect the old Monitor programs too, which is kind of fun.
Yes, that is.
And it really, I think today, listening to radio, one of the most fun parts to me is the commercials. If you listen to a Jack Benny program, for example, from the 1940s, the program sponsored, for example, by Great Nuts Flakes with Jack Benny, the commercials, the middle commercial was integrated into the program. And what was the most fun is when somebody flubbed a line and they just went right with it. And it just became part of the commercial, part of the show. And no one ever thought about it. It was just the way it was. And everyone enjoyed it. And that's one of the things that made that particular show on that day such a one that everyone empathized with and had a lot of fun with.
Jack, don't you think I better rehearse the commercial once? After all, this is a new product.
Okay, Don, yeah, rehearse it. We'll be on the air right away.
Ladies and gentlemen, next time you go to your neighborhood grocer, why not ask for America's most distinctive flake cereal? Toasty, brown, sweet as a nut, Grapes Nuts Flakes.
No, Don, not grapes. That's grape.
Oh, darn it. You will find that Grape Nuts Flakes are a thrifty buy in the big 12-ounce economy-size package. So be sure to look for the big red letters on the box.
Don, that was Jell-O. These are white letters, white.
So be sure to look for the big white letters on the
No,
box.
they're little white letters, little, Don.
So be sure to look for the little white letters on the box. They spell Grapes Nuts Flakes.
There you go again.
Oh, what's the matter with me?
That's another thing that we can look to radio, and early television was like that too. And it was that radio was driven by sponsors. If you had a radio show, one of the first things you did was go out and secure a sponsor so you could get on the air, and then that sponsor was tied in to your show. Sponsors played a much bigger role than they do now in what went on the air.
Well, somewhat. I think that in reality, some shows actually started as syndicated programs and then were picked up by sponsors, which was kind of cool. You had one sponsor for a program on radio, and if it was a half-hour program, probably there were 3 minutes of commercials at most. And that's why Jack Benny was so fun, because one of the commercials, the middle one, was integrated in as part of the program, which was perfectly okay. But even if you keep that same formula, it's still 3 minutes per a half hour. And for an hour program, like the Lux Radio Theater, sponsored by Lux Soap, for all the time that it was on the air from, 1935 to 1955, there was an opening commercial about Lux Toilet Soap and Lux Flakes. There were 3 acts, and there was a commercial between each of the acts, and in between Act 2 and 3, there was also a time for stations to identify themselves. So there were maybe 5 minutes of commercials, if I'm totaling it right, and the rest was truly part of the show. And today, again, we don't have sponsor loyalty to one sponsor sponsoring a program. So it's just television stations selling advertising, but advertising is so dominating it. There is so much that we see as opposed to as much entertainment, which is always a challenge.
If someone was going to get started, from the beginning, if they wanted to just hear a really good example of this kind of show, what would you recommend? What are some of your favorite individual episodes that would give us a good representative taste?
Well, again, from a humor standpoint, programs like Jack Benny are always funny. Phil Harris and Alice Faye. Phil Harris was a band leader Alice was his wife. She was a famous actress. And Phil Harris was on Jack Benny's program for many years as the band, the Phil Harris and his orchestra. Phil Harris and his orchestra were the band. Then he also started his own program, and they put together an incredible cast of characters for the Phil Harris Alice Faye show. The most famous part of it was sponsored by Rexall Druggist. Gail Gordon, another famous actor, was Mr. Scott, who was the Rexall rep or boss who represented the sponsor on the program. And Phil and Gail Gordon got into all sorts of things. There was a guy named from his real name was Elliot Lewis, again an actor. He played Frank Remley, who was supposed to be a guitar player. Remley was an actual character on the Phil Harris and Alice Faye program. And again, there's just a lot of humor and just the byplay back and forth between all of the major characters.
Phil, I wanted to ask you about that. Say, what's that list you have there?
Oh, that's my Christmas list.
Oh? How's it coming?
Well, I got a problem on one gift.
Are you having trouble finding a gift for your favorite blonde?
No, I'm getting her a mink coat. You're the one I'm having trouble. You snapped at that like a rainbow trout, didn't you? Honey, you know you're the only woman in my life. You're at the top of my list, and I'm going to get you something real good.
Oh, Phil, you really don't have to get me anything. After all, I have you, dear. And that's enough for any woman.
I see what you mean. I'll cross your name off the list, and then
Drop that pen.
Alice, please, you're twisting my conducting wrist.
Oh, by the way, do you have Mr. and Mrs. Scott's names on your list?
I got his name down, but why do we have to get something for her, too? She's so hard to please. She's been spoiled.
Yeah, she's an old fuss budget. She never likes anything.
Oh, now that's not true. Mrs. Scott is a very nice person.
Hey, I got an idea, Curly. Why don't you pick a fight with Mr. Scott? Then you wouldn't have to buy him anything.
Oh, wait a minute, Frankie. I can't pick a fight with a sponsor. A sponsor in radio is something that's sacred. Like a white elephant in India. Besides, Scotty's a pretty nice... I'll get it.
Oh, hello, Harris.
Well, Mr. Scott, come on in, sir. It's a pleasure to see you, sir.
Well, thank you.
Hello, Mr. Scott.
How do you do, Mrs. Harris?
Hiya, Scotty. I'm here, too.
Well, this is a disgusting surprise.
Quiet, Jumbo, or I won't give you any peanuts. You know, this is a coincidence, Scotty. Curly was just talking about your wife.
Oh, something nice, I hope.
I wouldn't say that.
Pay no attention to him, Mr. Scott. I said some very nice things about Mrs. Scott, and you know it, Frankie.
All right, you said nice things. If somebody said it about my wife, I'd punch him right in the nose.
Wait a minute. Mr. Scott, don't believe him. Alice and I were talking about your wife,
Never mind, Harris. If anybody said anything nasty about my wife, I know whose rum-soaked lips it came from.
Curly, now he's saying something nasty about your wife.
So Phil Harris and Alice Faye would be one. A long-time run would, of course, be Jack Benny. One of my favorite, I think probably my all-time favorite radio program was one particular episode of a program called Command Performance. Now, Command Performance was a radio program that was really created for the armed forces overseas. So it was very much around in the 40s, up into 1947 and 1948, but it was all of the actors and all of the celebrities that you would ever know back in those days volunteered to put their talents to work creating these programs that were not aired or heard in the U.S., but were only aired and heard by our troops overseas. And my favorite one from, I think it is February 15th, 1945, had probably the largest cast that I can think of right now of actors and actresses from that day. It was an hour-long comedy operetta about Dick Tracy. It was called Dick Tracy in B-flat, or For Goodness Sakes, Is He Ever Gonna Marry Tess Trueheart? And you had Bing Crosby playing Dick Tracy. Dinah Shore played Tess Trueheart. The Summer Sisters were played by the Andrews Sisters. Of course, everybody got to sing in this. Other people that you would know about, Jimmy Durante with his nose was the Mole. Bob Hope was Flat Top. Frank Sinatra played Shaky, and it went from there.
Wow.
It was just an incredible cast of people. And it was just one joke after another. My favorite scene is the show starts out, Dick and Tess are going to get married. Everything is all set. The judge is there. Judge Hooper is there. He's gonna marry them and all that. And he says, Tess, do you take Dick Tracy to be your husband? And she says, I do. And Dick, do you take Tess Trueheart to be your lawful wedded wife? And he says, I do. Oh, good, finally. And he says, and I now pronounce you. And about that time, the phone rings. And it's the police chief, who's played by Jerry Colonna. And he says, and so Dick Tracy answers the phone. He says, I'm sorry, I have to take this. And he goes, Tracy on this end. And the police chief goes, police chief at this end. And then he says that there is a robbery at the bank. And I forget the specifics about the bank, the First National Bank or something. And so Tracy says, I've got to go solve this. Of course, so they're not married yet, right? So he sings a song about going off to catch a crooked mob, and then he drives away, and Tess sings a song about being left at the altar again. The song that Tess sings ends, and then you hear Tracy pulling into the parking lot, slams on the brakes, runs into the bank, and he says, this is Dick Tracy. Put up your hands, you swine. Nobody's here. And then you hear, drop your gun and turn around, Tracy. And Tracy says, if that voice belongs to who I think it does, I may never turn around. It's Bob Hope playing Flat Top. And of course, anybody would recognize his voice who knows that time. Anyway, Tracy says, if that voice belongs to who I think it is, I may never turn around. And then Bob Hope says, what a pleasure. I always wanted to have a gun in this guy's back. And Tracy says, yeah, you could pull it up a little bit too. And Bob Hope says, sorry, I was going to blow your brains out. I mean, that was just the quality for the whole show. It's my favorite radio program, probably of all time.
You guessed it, Tracy. I'm Flat Top.
Flat Top? How did you ever get a flat top on that egg-shaped head of yours? Well, now that you got me, Flat Top, what are you going to do with me?
You're not going to like this at all. You'll probably hate every minute of it. You're really going to get the full treatment, Dad. Oh, what's going to happen to you?
Well, what's going to happen? I'd like to laugh a little, too.
I'm going to put you in the vault, pour a pitcher of cream over your head, and then throw in a tiger with a rough tongue.
Proceed. Dick Tracy fears not your threats. The author will find a way out.
Well, you'll never get out of this vault, you marble-headed hero. First, I'll close the steel door. Now I'll twirl the combination. And now I'll slide in the boat. There.
Hey, Junior, you forgot something. I'm still on the outside.
There was an interchange, too. There were big stars in other mediums that came onto radio, and then there were stars that radio created, right?
Well, Groucho Marx. Of course, You Bet Your Life was a radio program that also then went to television. Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy. Bergen was a ventriloquist, and Charlie was his
a piece of wood with painting on it.
Yes. That was always my favorite show. Put a ventriloquist on the radio. Yeah, that works.
And it was one of the funniest shows on the air. And it was great. One of the stories that I've never been able to verify, but I think it's true. First of all, Charlie McCarthy battled with everyone. Right. And so, for example, he was always going after W.C. Fields. And there was one program that started out, Charlie said, our sponsor is Maxwell House. That's Friendship in a Cup. And our guest today is Mr. W.C. Fields. That's Friendship in a Hiccup. But they always went at it. And I understand that sometime in the course of their feud, Charlie said something and W.C. Fields grabs him away from Edgar Bergen, pulls out a saw and saws Charlie in half. I read it somewhere, and I don't know if it's true, but I wouldn't put it past any of them. That would certainly have flabbergasted Bergen. But at the end, before Fields died, they actually made peace, so it was okay.
Are you eating a tomato or is that your nose?
Very good, Charles. You must come down with me after the show to the lumber yard to ride piggyback on the buzzsaws.
Nobody's going to find me after the show.
Yes, they are. You'll be hanging in my window as a Venetian blind.
That makes me shudder.
Quiet, or I'll throw a woodpecker on you.
You know, I've always been very fond of our feathered friend. Yes. Large or small, tame or wild.
Blonde or brunette, yeah. Bill, you have quite a collection, haven't you?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have, Aunt Karen. I always had a very rare Australian duck-billed platypus.
How small is this bird? Do you have to have glasses to see it?
Yes, about 3 or 4.
Is it true, Mr. Fields, that when you stood on the corner of Hollywood and Vine, 43 cars waited for your nose to change to green? No.
No way, you woodpecker's lunch. You know, Charles, many's the time I wish you could be here to fill that terrible vacancy.
In your heart, Mr. Fields?
Oh, in my fireplace.
Heard a couple of the Charlie McCarthy, Edgar Bergen shows, and I have to say the humor is so fast and so dense. I mean, the you know what I mean, the prattle and the it's so fast.
Sure,
it's almost it's really difficult not to think that there are at least 2 people in front of the mic.
Oh yeah,
you know, Bergen was at his peak an astounding talent.
Oh, absolutely. I regret never having had a chance to meet them. He lectured once at UC Irvine, but it was right during my show, so we didn't get a chance to meet him. So I was very disappointed at that. But he was. The only show that probably was significantly faster would have been a British show, and you got to understand British humor to really deal with it. But it's the Goon Show.
Oh my God, yes.
And of course, and the Goons, of course, included Peter Sellers.
Yes, Peter Sellers and Spike Milligan.
Gary Seacombe and Spike Milligan.
Oh yes,
yeah.
And if you ever want to hear the godfathers of I'm Sorry, I'll Read That Again, and Beyond the Fringe, and
Inspector Clouseau,
and Monty P. and the Firesign. Did I say Firesign Theater? Yes,
you didn't, but you just did.
Okay, they are the godfathers of that kind of anarchic, and of course they're descended in their own British way from the tradition of the Marx Brothers, but so crazy and so much more surreal. You know, they have I forget why, but they're talking to themselves, and they always comment on the show. Like Harry Seacombe says something and then says, thinks to self, that wasn't much of a line.
Yeah.
You know?
but you had to pay attention with your whole mind and body when they were on, because if you drifted for 5 seconds, you lost it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it took time to catch back up, and you had to catch back up. So they were so fast and so funny.
At the time, I was asleep in my electrified elephant hammock when through the pigeonhole flew a carrier pigeon. There was something strapped to his leg. It was the postman.
Letter for you, sir.
Thank you. Hurriedly, I tore open the letter. Inside was an envelope. With a message that said,
report at once to MI5.
The letter was written. The letter was written in a disguised voice. Hurriedly strapping on a fresh pigeon, I flew out the window.
Come in.
Captain
Captain Harry Seagoon reporting for duty as instructed, sir. I'm ready to die for the flag, bleed for my country, suffer great sufferings, and all for England!
You twit.
Put up a jab.
Well, they at one point, I'll just share with the audience. At one point in the Goon Show, just to give an example of how crazy things could be, they all agree that all of the sound effects people in the studio have gone on strike, and so they agree that they'll do all of the sound effects themselves.
Sound effects.
And so one guy is trying to tie a shoe, and he says, I wonder what the sound effect for a shoelace is.
Shoelace.
And they go, that's the that's the sound effect. Who's to say no?
All of it live.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
And it was all done in front of audiences too, or a majority of them. There were studio audiences for these radio shows.
Yes.
Yeah. So they were performing for live people and getting live laughs. Or maybe not.
There's so many stories. Marvin Miller, who was one of the most well-known radio announcers, and of course went on to be on a TV show called The Millionaire. He was Michael Anthony. He had this deep baritone voice and was a wonderful announcer. But he tells the story of being involved in so many different radio programs in the Chicago area that literally 1 week he did 90 different shows.
Wow.
And in fact, had to be taken by boat on Lake Michigan to go from one side of the city to another just to get from one place to the other in time to be able to do the broadcast.
That is such a great story. I imagine that I used to imagine that that's what, at the top of his career, Orson Welles would be doing in New York City, taking taxis to and from the various shows that he was on at any one time, doing voices, being an announcer, being a producer, being a writer, right? And that he's just crisscrossing. And this is in the late 30s and throughout the 40s. He would be just driving all over New York City, going to every radio station and recording studio and doing these shows.
And make no mistake, Orson Welles was good at comedy as well. Jack Benny was ill in 1943 for several shows, and Orson Welles came on to take his place and was as funny as it could be. Those are also some of my favorite radio shows. And he brought his own cast of characters. I'm trying to remember the name of his secretary who on the show for these four was again a very famous person, but I'm trying to remember her name. And then there was Mr. Toodlequirtle, and at one point one of the people said they were totaling up money or something. He says, "What's the total, Toodlequirtle?" And they got that out without a flub. But he was incredible and was as funny as anyone could be, and carried those programs for the 4 weeks that Jack was out. The rest of the crew was there, but Jack was ill. And I think it was a pretty serious illness, but then he did come back.
Now, operator, I'd like to talk to Mr. Benny. Oh, his temperature went down. He checked out. Very well, I'll call him there. Goodbye. That's strange.
What's the matter? Did Jack leave the Arizona Biltmore?
Yes, it seems he's now stopping at the Jasmine Blossom Auto Court.
The Jasmine Blossom?
Hey, I just thought of something. Jasmine Blossom. That's J.B., the same initials as Mr. Benny.
That's right, Dennis, and I'm sure Jack will come home with some lovely monogrammed towels. Miss Harrington, remind me to call Mr. Benny first thing tomorrow morning at the Jasmine Blossom Auto Court.
Yes, Mr. Wells.
Excuse me. Come in. Well, it's those two merry madcaps from the soda fountain. Hello, fellows.
Hello, Mr. Wells. Here's that comedy sketch we wrote for you. There's a little mayonnaise on it, but it's very jolly.
Thank you, fellows. By the way, would you like to stay and hear your little gem?
I don't know. Should we stay, Gil? We can't stay. That fat lady is waiting for her cheeseburger.
Oh, yes. Let's go.
Wait till I open the door.
Well, let's see what they've written here. So far, nothing but mayonnaise. A little crude, but it'll get by. And now, ladies and gentlemen, for our feature attraction this evening, we are going to present a mystery melodrama entitled Death at Midnight or the Murder Case. On this drama, I will play the role of Inspector Wells of police headquarters. Bill, you'll be my assistant, Sergeant Harris, and Dennis, you will be my other assistant, Sergeant Day. It is your duty to help me solve a horrible crime.
So, Mike, if anybody, let's review here. If anybody is interested in catching up with Old Time Radio, listening to some of the shows, maybe getting involved, how would they do that?
I would definitely suggest they go to sperdvac.org, sperdvac.org, and join. It's $20 a year. They have a large library of programs and also just probably the most knowledgeable collection of people on radio programs and so on. If people want to listen, definitely I suggest yesterdayusa.com. If they want to hear Gunsmoke, there's a program called WRCW Radio, and that's all Gunsmoke 24 hours a day.
Oh my gosh.
And there's WRCW Radio 2, which is other Westerns like Have Gun Will Travel and Fort Laramie and the Cisco Kid and others. Then they also have WRCW Crime Story. So there are three different ones, and they do crime stuff. I mentioned WNAR. That's another place to go. Sirius XM is definitely well known. Greg Bell is well known in the industry, and also talks a lot about the history as he's doing the different shows. So there are a lot of places to go. But if people want to really get involved and learn about it and interact with people, best place to go is Sperdvac. As I said, Radio Enthusiast of Puget Sound Reps is another place. They can find that online and go there as well. There are a number of old radio groups, and all you got to do is Google them, and they're out there. Hey, by the way, you guys, why do radio announcers have small hands?
I don't know why.
We pause for station identification. Anyway,
this is giving me nightmares of being back on college radio.
We pause for station.
All right. Thanks, Mike.
You guys be well.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube this and any year.
Let us know how we're doing. You can email us at musicalinnertube@gmail.com.
You can leave us a message or a voicemail on our website, musicalinnertube.com.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for providing us with our theme music.